Lieutenant Commander Sarah adjusted the brim of her cap as she stepped off the black Suburban and onto the concrete of the naval weapons range. The late morning sun bore down with an unforgiving brightness, bouncing off the steel fencing and equipment, making the world shimmer with heat. Gravel crunched beneath her boots with each deliberate step. The air smelled faintly of gun oil, burnt powder, and salt drifting in from the nearby coast. To most, this was just another day at the range. To her, it was a trial, an unspoken judgment disguised as a routine demonstration. Clusters of sailors and junior officers lined the observation deck, some leaning casually on the railing, others whispering as she passed. She felt their eyes on her, not cruel but skeptical. She was used to that look. It was the same one she had encountered throughout her career. Too young, too smart, not battle-tested enough. In a Navy where tradition often outweighed innovation, Sarah was both an outsider and a disruptor. At the center of the crowd, a knot of senior officers stood apart, their crisp uniforms immaculate, their posture radiating authority. Admiral Jonathan Rogers was among them. Tall, broad-shouldered, his white cap angled just so, he carried himself like a man who had never once needed to prove his worth. Rogers was a decorated veteran, the kind who had seen real combat and wore scars like medals. His word carried weight, not because of his rank alone, but because he had earned it in fire and steel. And yet, that same authority made him dangerous to Sarah's work. Rogers had never believed in her project. She remembered the first time he had scoffed at her modifications to the Navy's .50 caliber machine gun platform. "The M2 has been with us since World War II," he'd said. "It survived every battlefield, every theater. And you think a few tweaks and theories can outsmart history." His words had been sharp, cutting, dismissive. To him, her efforts to reduce recoil and increase precision were wasted energy, academic exercises that belonged in classrooms, not combat zones. Now he stood at the railing, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. His presence was not casual. He was here for one reason, to watch her fail. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her stride even. She had learned long ago that defiance didn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it was silent, calculated, and patient. The weapon she had worked on, the modified .50 cal, was not theory. It was the result of months of sleepless nights, bruised shoulders, broken prototypes, and relentless testing. She hadn't just tinkered, she had transformed it into something new, something the Navy hadn't realized it needed yet. But proving that to Rogers, and to every officer watching, required more than blueprints and lab reports. It required performance under pressure. The staging area was alive with noise. Sailors shouting commands, forklifts carrying steel targets, the metallic clang of plates being set upright. 6 reinforced steel targets had been arranged at combat distance, gleaming under the sun. Each plate was a silent dare, waiting for her. She inhaled slowly, centering herself. This was not her first test, but it was her most important. Whispers floated around her like gnats. "Is that her? She's the one claiming groupings. Bet she can't even keep it steady." She ignored them all. Her focus narrowed on the weapon mounted at the firing lane. Its matte black frame shimmered faintly, sunlight glinting off the polished barrel. The .50 cal had always been a beast, powerful, deafening, unforgiving. Most respected it with a hint of fear. Sarah respected it like an old friend. As she approached the firing lane, she felt the weight of history pressing down. The Navy didn't often give second chances. Fail here and her modifications would be shelved, her credibility shredded. Succeed, and she wouldn't just silence the whispers, she'd redefine the weapon itself. She placed her hands briefly on the weapon's side, feeling its cold steel, grounding herself. For a moment, she closed her eyes and remembered the journey that had brought her here. The lab tests, the skepticism, the mockery, the long nights staring at schematics until the lines blurred. When she opened her eyes again, the range stretched before her like a stage. The audience was ready. The Admiral was watching. The targets were waiting. Sarah wasn't here to talk anymore. She was here to prove. The briefing room buzzed with the low murmur of voices, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of papers and the clink of coffee mugs. Large screens displayed schematics of weapons platforms, performance charts, and ammunition breakdowns. Officers sat in neat rows, their uniforms sharp, their expressions ranging from mild interest to quiet skepticism. At the front of the room, Lieutenant Commander Sarah stood beside her presentation board, her posture straight, her voice steady as she explained the refinements she had engineered for the Navy's .50 caliber system. "This configuration," she said, pointing at the diagram, "introduces a recoil-dampening assembly that not only reduces shoulder fatigue, but maintains barrel stability under sustained fire. Our testing shows a grouping pattern and a 12% improvement in rapid target engagement compared to the unmodified platform." The numbers were clean. The logic was solid. Yet she could feel the weight of their eyes, not convinced but waiting for someone else to speak. And inevitably, that someone was Admiral Jonathan Rogers. From the back row, his voice cut through the room like a blade. "Grouping, improved stability." He leaned back in his chair, the faintest curl of a smirk playing on his lips. "Lieutenant Commander, the M2 has been firing reliably since Normandy, since Korea, since the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of Iraq. Are you suggesting that every Marine, every sailor, every soldier who carried it into battle was somehow doing it wrong until now?" Laughter rippled through the room, not cruel but sharp enough to sting. Sarah didn't flinch. She let the noise pass over her, her hands steady on the edge of the podium. "No, sir," she said evenly. "I'm suggesting that they carried it as far as it could go, and now it can go further." The smirk deepened. Rogers tilted his head, studying her as if she were some overly ambitious cadet trying to lecture veterans on war. "Further, you say? And what's next? Teach it to cook breakfast, to fold laundry." More chuckles followed, this time louder. Sarah's face remained calm, but her chest tightened. Every joke he made wasn't just at her expense. It chipped at her work, her hours, her proof. She clicked the remote and a video appeared on the screen. It showed test footage. A gunner firing the modified .50 cal, the muzzle climbing less, the rounds hitting steel plates in quick succession with minimal spread. The results were undeniable. But Rogers wasn't interested in numbers on a screen. He leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on her. "That's in your controlled environment. In the field, under stress, under pressure, it's different. A weapon is only as good as the person firing it. And forgive me for saying so, Lieutenant Commander, but you don't look like you've been behind that weapon in the middle of chaos." The words landed heavier than the laughter. It wasn't just skepticism. It was dismissal. Her credibility wasn't only tied to her invention, but to her identity, her lack of combat scars compared to men like him. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "With respect, Admiral, combat doesn't give excuses. Either a weapon works or it doesn't. This one works." The room quieted. For a moment her words hung in the air, heavy with defiance. Rogers studied her, then chuckled softly, though this time there was no real humor in it. "Very well," he said, standing. His height and presence filled the room like a storm cloud. "You seem so confident. Let's put confidence to the test. 6 reinforced steel plates, combat distance under 30 seconds. Drop them all and maybe I'll believe your little miracle machine deserves a place in my Navy. Fail." He let the word linger, savoring it. "And your modifications die here on this base with this demonstration." Gasps and murmurs spread across the rows. Officers exchanged looks, some intrigued, others pitying. The challenge wasn't fair and everyone knew it, but fairness had never been Rogers' language. He spoke only in terms of results. Sarah's eyes met his, unwavering. The Admiral expected hesitation, maybe a stammer, but instead she simply said, "Understood." A silence fell over the room, thicker than before. The Admiral's smile returned, sharp and cold. "Then we'll see if your theory bleeds steel the way you claim." The meeting adjourned with chairs scraping and boots echoing on the floor. Officers whispered as they filed out, their voices a blur of doubt and bets. Sarah gathered her notes slowly, her movements deliberate. The challenge had been laid, and she had accepted without hesitation. But inside, her pulse hammered with the knowledge of what it meant. This was no longer about schematics or presentations. This was about proving herself in front of the entire command, under the gaze of the one man who would rather see her fail than change the weapon he trusted. As the last officer left the room, Sarah closed her laptop, exhaled, and whispered to herself, "Fine, let's prove it." Word of the Admiral's challenge traveled through the base faster than any official memo could. By nightfall, sailors in the mess hall were already whispering about it over trays of coffee and reheated rations. By morning, it had become the event everyone wanted to witness. Lieutenant Commander Sarah wasn't just scheduled for a live-fire demonstration. She was set to go head-to-head with the Navy's unshakable standard of tradition, embodied by Admiral Jonathan Rogers. The range had been reserved. Steel plates were ordered, reinforced twice to ensure they wouldn't crumble too easily. Officers, engineers, and even a few Marines attached to the base began lining up hours before the scheduled trial. It wasn't every day that an admiral publicly challenged a weapons specialist, and it wasn't every day that someone had the courage, or audacity, to accept without blinking. Sarah knew the weight of the crowd's curiosity. She could hear it in the murmurs as she made her way toward the prep area. "Bet she doesn't even knock two down. She's sharp in a lab, but the range is a different animal." Admiral Rogers set her up. "No way she clears 6 in 30 seconds. The whispers weren't malicious, just skeptical, fed by years of tradition that said the M2 Browning was untouchable, perfect as it was. Who was she to claim otherwise? A woman who had spent more hours in front of computer screens and simulation labs than on the battlefield. To them, she was a tinkerer trying to rewrite history with screws and optics. But Sarah had expected this reaction. She had lived in it for years, the quiet resistance that came whenever she pushed against the old ways. She walked steadily, ignoring the whispers, her uniform pressed, her eyes forward. The challenge didn't frighten her, it crystallized her purpose. At the firing lane, the crew was already setting up the targets. 6 steel plates stood in a row at combat distance, sunlight flashing off their reinforced surfaces. They looked immovable, smug even, like silent guardians of the Admiral's pride. A naval ensign supervised the setup, double-checking that the timer system was operational. Every second would matter, and Rogers had ensured the conditions left no room for excuses. From the observation tower, Admiral Rogers arrived flanked by senior officers. He carried himself with the ease of a man certain of the outcome. His hands were clasped behind his back, his eyes narrowing as they followed Sarah's approach. If he felt any pressure from issuing such a public challenge, he didn't show it. In fact, he almost seemed to enjoy the spectacle. "Lieutenant Commander," his voice boomed over the loudspeakers, "today is simple. 6 targets, 1 weapon, 30 seconds. Success is measurable, failure is absolute." The words echoed across the range, final and cold. Sarah nodded once, refusing to break his gaze. "Understood, sir." A few officers shifted uncomfortably at her composure. They had expected nerves, maybe a flicker of hesitation. Instead, they saw calm resolve. It unsettled them more than if she had looked afraid. As the crews cleared the lane, Sarah walked toward the weapon mounted on its tripod. The modified .50 cal sat there like a beast-leashed black steel gleaming under the sun. It was massive, powerful, and unforgiving, an old war machine wearing new armor thanks to her. She rested her hand on the receiver, feeling the cold steel vibrate faintly with restrained power. Behind her, the murmurs of the crowd rose again. Bets were being made quietly, cigars, bottles of whiskey, weekend passes. No one thought she would clear all 6, not against time, not with the Admiral's eyes drilling into her from above. But Sarah didn't hear them. She heard only the sound of her own breathing, steady and controlled. She thought back to every simulation she had run, every test that had pushed her to refine the system. She had designed the recoil dampening assembly. She had tested the optics until her vision blurred. She had earned the right to stand here, weapon in hand. The Admiral's voice cut through the speakers again, calm but edged with smugness. "When the buzzer sounds, you begin. Show us what your invention can do, Lieutenant Commander." Sarah settled behind the weapon, adjusting the optics with practiced movements. Her gloves fit snugly, her body aligned perfectly with the mount. Every adjustment was a ritual, a preparation not just of steel but of mind. The targets gleamed in the distance. The crowd held its breath. This was no longer about schematics or theory or even the Admiral's scorn. This was about steel against will, tradition against innovation. Sarah narrowed her eyes, finger resting just outside the trigger guard. She was ready. When the buzzer sounded, there would be no more words, only proof. The firing lane was a world apart from the chatter and whispers behind her. Out there, the crowd speculated, doubted, even laughed. But here, on this strip of gravel and steel, only one thing mattered: the weapon. Sarah approached the mounted .50 caliber like a surgeon stepping into an operating room. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, each step measured. She had no need to rush. Time would begin only when the buzzer sounded. Until then, every second was hers, and she intended to use them wisely. The weapon itself sat on its tripod like a beast crouching in wait. Sunlight glinted off its barrel, the matte black receiver absorbing the heat. It was a weapon older than anyone on the field, a legend of war and destruction. To most, it was intimidating, violent, even in silence. To Sarah, it was familiar. She had lived with this machine longer than some sailors lived with their spouses. She had studied its anatomy, dismantled it, rebuilt it, improved it. She laid her hands on the receiver, grounding herself in the cold steel. Her fingers moved with the grace of ritual. She pulled open the feed tray, ran her eyes along the belt of gleaming brass cartridges, checked the linkages, ensured the chamber was clean. Not a single round could be, not a single hiccup could be tolerated. Behind her, the murmurs carried. "She's stalling. Look at her fussing, nervous hands. Bet she doesn't even get halfway through before the buzzer times her out." She tuned them out, focusing only on the weapon. Each adjustment was precise. The elevation screw tightened, the traverse knob aligned, the optics calibrated. The new recoil dampening system gleamed faintly, its springs and housings blending seamlessly into the old frame. To anyone else, it looked like just another bulky piece of hardware. To her, it was revolution disguised as familiarity. Sarah crouched lower, pressing her cheek to the stock, peering through the optic. The 6 steel plates gleamed in the distance, lined up like soldiers waiting to be tested. The range shimmered in the heat, the air thick with expectation. She adjusted the crosshairs until the first plate was dead center. Perfect. Her breathing slowed. Inhale, hold, exhale. The rhythm was automatic now, drilled into her through endless practice. Each breath was a reset, a reminder that the weapon would follow her lead, not the other way around. The observation deck creaked as Admiral Rogers shifted his weight. He leaned forward, studying her every move with hawk-like focus. His arms were crossed, but his eyes betrayed something else: impatience, maybe irritation. Sarah was calm, too calm, and calmness was unnerving. He had expected trembling hands, rushed preparation, signs of nerves. Instead, he saw precision. Sarah adjusted her gloves, tugging them tight. She ran her thumb along the grip, feeling the familiar grooves. Then she placed her hands lightly on the weapon's handles, not gripping yet, just resting. It was like shaking hands with an old ally before stepping into battle. The range officer called out, 30 seconds prep time remaining. Her eyes flicked once to the timer, then back to the plates. 30 seconds was more than enough. She had already done what needed to be done. Now it was just patience. She leaned back slightly, rolling her shoulders, letting the tension bleed from her muscles. Around her, the world seemed to fade, the murmurs of doubt, the creak of boots, even the hiss of the wind. She could feel her heart beating, steady and strong. She thought of the long nights in the lab, the prototypes that shattered, the recoil bruises that left her arms aching. All of it had led to this moment. The Admiral's voice crackled over the speaker, low and taunting. "Any time now, Lieutenant Commander. Don't waste the audience's patience." She ignored him. His words were meant to disrupt, to poke holes in her composure. But Sarah wasn't here to trade words anymore. She was here to prove something, not to him, but to the weapon, to the Navy, and to herself. The range officer raised a hand. "Shooter ready." Sarah tightened her grip on the handles, her voice steady as steel. "Ready." The crowd went quiet. Even the doubters hushed, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Her finger hovered near the trigger, but not yet. Her eyes narrowed through the optic, the first plate crystal clear. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't scared. She was ready. The officer's voice boomed, "Stand by." Sarah inhaled once more, filling her lungs with air, grounding herself. 3, 2, 1. The buzzer sounded. The beast was about to awaken. The buzzer shrieked, sharp and metallic, and instantly the silence shattered. Sarah squeezed the trigger and the .50 caliber roared to life like thunder breaking across the valley. The weapon's bark was deafening, its recoil surging against her hands with a raw, bone-shaking force. But she didn't flinch. She didn't fight it. Instead, she guided it, harnessing the beast she had tamed with her own design. The first round slammed into the steel plate with a resounding clang, dust and fragments erupting in a cloud. The plate wobbled, then toppled, crashing to the ground with a final metallic groan. Gasps burst from the observation deck. She had dropped the first plate in less than 2 seconds. Without hesitation, Sarah swung the weapon to the second target. The optic's reticle snapped into place, her breath steady. Another thunderous burst split the air, brass casing spitting out in a golden rain. The second plate shuddered violently, then collapsed into the dust. 2 down, the crowd stirred, the murmurs swelling. Doubt began to tremble at the edges of their certainty. Sarah didn't hear them. Her world had narrowed to the optic, the reticle, the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She was no longer on a firing line surrounded by skeptics. She was in the zone, the place she had lived during every simulation, every late-night trial. Her body moved with instinct sharpened by repetition, her mind calm even as the weapon's roar shook the earth beneath her. She swung to the third plate, finger tight on the trigger. The recoil hit, but the new dampening assembly absorbed the kick like a cushion of air, keeping the muzzle flat. The third plate fell as quickly as the others, another steel soldier cut down in seconds. By now, the observation deck was leaning forward. Officers who had smirked earlier now gripped the railing, eyes wide. Admiral Rogers' smirk had faded, his jaw set tight as his eyes tracked every shot. Sarah adjusted again, the fourth plate in her sights. The crowd barely had time to blink before another burst rang out, sharper, faster than expected. The plate staggered, then toppled with a clang that echoed across the range. 4 down. The weapon smoked, the air thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Spent casings piled at her feet, clinking as they scattered across the gravel. Sarah's pulse stayed steady, her breaths measured. Her body was calm, but her focus sharpened like a blade. The fifth plate loomed. She shifted, lined up, and squeezed. The recoil pressed into her arms, but she absorbed it, leaned forward, and unleashed another flurry. The fifth plate crashed to the ground, joining its fallen brothers. 5 down. Now only one plate remained, standing tall against the haze of dust and smoke. Sarah adjusted her grip, centering the reticle, her finger poised. This was the moment that mattered. 5 plates was impressive. 6 plates would be legendary. She drew in one last deep breath, steadying her heartbeat. Her finger squeezed. The .50 cal barked again, fire leaping from its barrel. The 6th plate shuddered, buckled, then toppled with a resounding clang that seemed to echo louder than all the others combined. 6 down. The buzzer was still ticking, its red numbers flashing. 24 seconds. The crowd erupted into stunned silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the hiss of the smoking barrel and the soft clink of the last brass casing as it hit the gravel. Sarah slowly lifted her hands from the weapon's grips, her movements calm and deliberate, as if she had simply completed routine maintenance rather than demolished 6 steel targets in record time. She straightened, adjusted her cap, and let the silence stretch. Then faintly someone in the back muttered, "Holy hell!" It broke the tension. Gasps turned into shouts and the range buzzed with disbelief. Some clapped, others just shook their heads, but all of them knew they had seen something extraordinary. Admiral Rogers did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the fallen plates, his expression unreadable. His smirk was gone, replaced by something else, something heavier. Sarah stepped back from the weapon, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She had done it. Not for the applause, not for the Admiral, but for the proof that her creation worked, and no one could deny it anymore. The beast had roared, and the steel had fallen. For a moment after the last plate hit the dirt, time itself seemed to freeze. The air hung heavy with smoke, the barrel of the .50 cal glowing faintly, heat waves shimmering around it. The acrid stench of burnt powder clung to everything, scratching throats and filling lungs. Brass casings still rolled lazily across the gravel at Sarah's boots, a metallic chime that seemed far too soft compared to the thunder they had just endured. 6 plate, 6 direct hits. The range was silent. Not the polite silence of discipline, but the stunned silence of disbelief, of men and women trying to reconcile what their eyes had just seen with what their minds had told them was impossible. Up in the tower, Admiral Jonathan Rogers remained motionless, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His face betrayed nothing, but the tension in his jaw, the faint narrowing of his eyes, spoke volumes. He had expected failure. He had counted on it. Instead, he had just watched the weapon he dismissed tear through 6 reinforced steel targets in under 30 seconds. A sharp beep broke the silence. Everyone's eyes snapped to the digital timer mounted on the range wall. The numbers glowed red, 24.3 seconds. The officers on the observation deck stirred. Whispers erupted, urgent and disbelieving. 24 seconds. No way, that can't be right. She didn't just beat the mark, she crushed it. One of the technicians, pale and wide-eyed, leaned over to double-check the system, his fingers flying across the console. After a moment he straightened, nodding stiffly. Confirmed. 24.3 seconds. That was when the silence finally cracked. A wave of gasps and low exclamations rippled across the crowd. A few clapped instinctively, though most simply stared at Sarah like she had performed a magic trick rather than a demonstration of physics and engineering. Sarah, for her part, remained calm. She stepped back from the weapon, gloves still warm against her hands, and gave a respectful nod to the range officer. She neither smiled nor sought the crowd's approval. Her expression was composed, almost serene. She had known she could do it. This wasn't luck. It was the inevitable outcome of years of work and belief in her system. She turned her gaze toward the 6 fallen plates. They lay sprawled in the dust like toppled monuments, proof carved in steel that her design worked. For her, they weren't trophies. They were vindication. The murmurs grew louder. Some officers leaned into each other, already debating what this meant for the Navy's weapons program. Others looked uneasy, as if the ground beneath their tradition had just shifted. Admiral Rogers finally moved. He stepped forward in the tower, his cap gleaming under the harsh sunlight, his gaze locked on Sarah. Though his posture was still rigid, the smugness that had colored his demeanor before was gone. He could hide many things, but not this. He had been wrong. The crowd sensed it, too. Eyes darted between and Rogers, as if waiting for the next act in a play. The Admiral had mocked her, dismissed her, challenged her in front of them all. Now she had not only met his challenge but obliterated it. A nervous laugh escaped one of the younger officers on the deck, quickly stifled when Roger's gaze swept over the group. The laughter died, replaced again by silence. Sarah straightened, her hands clasped lightly behind her back, mirroring the Admiral's posture but without the stiffness. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply stood tall, the picture of military professionalism. That was, perhaps, what unsettled them most. She wasn't celebrating because to her, this was never about proving herself to them. It was about proving the weapon, and she had done so flawlessly. The range officer cleared his throat, his voice carrying over the loudspeakers. Demonstration complete, all targets neutralized. Time confirmed, 24.3 seconds. The announcement rang like a bell, final and undeniable. A murmur of awe spread again through the spectators. No one could argue. Numbers didn't lie. The plates didn't lie. Sarah had just set a new standard right in front of them. For the first time since the challenge began, Sarah allowed herself a small breath of relief. She felt it wash over her like a tide receding after a storm. Not triumph, not arrogance, just a quiet release of the tension that had carried her to this moment. She adjusted her cap against the sunlight, turned her gaze back to the smoking weapon, and whispered softly to herself, words no one else could hear. "Told you." The steel plates lay scattered in the dirt, each one a fallen witness to Sarah's defiance. The echoes of gunfire had faded, leaving only the faint hiss of heat escaping from the weapon's barrel. For a long moment, no one dared to move, as though stepping too soon might disturb the weight of what had just happened. On the observation deck, officers and dignitaries exchanged uncertain glances. Many of them had arrived expecting to see a young engineer humbled, her theories disproven in a blaze of failure. Instead, they had watched 6 targets collapse in less than half a minute. The disbelief that lingered in their eyes was slowly giving way to something else: respect. Captain, one of the senior officers, was the first to break the silence. His voice carried low but firm, his words directed more at himself than anyone else. "I've been in this service for 30 years, he said, shaking his head, "and I've never seen a .50 cal handle like that." Others murmured in agreement, their skepticism crumbling piece by piece. The whisper of admiration spread like a current, unspoken but undeniable. Sarah hadn't just proven her weapon, she had shifted the boundaries of what they believed was possible. Down on the range, Sarah stood calm and composed, her shoulders square, her eyes steady. She didn't seek the applause, didn't glance up to bask in the crowd's reaction. She let the silence linger. She knew silence could be louder than noise, more commanding than cheers. At last, Admiral Rogers moved. He stepped forward on the observation deck, his boots striking the metal with a sharp, deliberate rhythm. The crowd hushed again, as though sensing the weight of the moment. All eyes turned toward him. The Admiral rested his hands behind his back, his gaze locked on Sarah. The smug grin he'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by an expression carved from stone. He didn't look defeated, but he didn't look victorious either. He looked measured. "Lieutenant," his voice boomed across the range, steady and deep, "you've made your point." The words hung in the air, not quite praise, not quite concession. But everyone recognized the significance. The Admiral, a man infamous for his disdain toward untested ideas, had acknowledged her achievement. For someone of his stature, it was as close to an admission as they would ever hear. Sarah raised her chin slightly, acknowledging the Admiral's words with a firm nod. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. This was enough. From the back of the deck, someone began to clap. It was hesitant at first, uncertain, but soon others joined in. The sound grew louder, more assured, until it rolled across the range like a tide. Officers, technicians, even a few hardened veterans who rarely gave credit outside their own ranks, applauding. Sarah let the applause wash over her, but she didn't let it shake her composure. Her hands remained clasped behind her back, her boots planted firm in the gravel. To anyone watching, she looked less like a woman basking in victory and more like a soldier standing ready for orders. Still deep inside she felt it, the respect, hard-won, reluctant but real. As the clapping subsided, Captain leaned toward another officer. His voice, though hushed, carried a note of conviction. If she can do that on the range, imagine what she could do in the field. The remark spread quickly, whispered from one mouth to another. Ideas took root in the silence, new tactics, new possibilities, a future reshaped by the demonstration they had just witnessed. Admiral Rogers' eyes never left Sarah. He studied her with the intensity of a man recalculating, reassessing everything he thought he knew. To him, this wasn't just about 6 plates. It was about the balance of tradition and innovation, about whether the Navy would cling to its old ways or embrace the new. Finally, Rogers gave a short nod, his expression unreadable. He turned on his heel and walked back into the tower without another word. But to those who knew him, the gesture spoke louder than any speech. He had acknowledged her, not just in words but in the rare language of respect. Sarah exhaled slowly, the tension of the morning melting away. She had walked into this demonstration mocked, doubted, and underestimated. She would walk out of it with something far more valuable than applause: credibility. The silence had spoken and respect had followed. The clapping had faded, the range quiet once more, but the weight of what had happened lingered in every breath, in every sideways glance between officers. 6 plates on the ground, 24 seconds on the clock, and the impossible turned into fact. By late afternoon, the documentation began. A technician knelt near the weapon, gloves on, carefully collecting data. Others photographed the plates, measuring dents, calculating impact force, every detail filed under protocol. But this wasn't just routine paperwork, everyone knew it. This was history being written. On a clipboard marked in red ink, the range officer scrawled the title: Mission FILES, Demonstration LTSKANE. The words looked simple, but they carried weight. Mission files meant official record. Mission files meant permanence. What had started as a spectacle of doubt was now sealed in the Navy's archives, a story that could no longer be. Sarah stood quietly to one side as the process unfolded. She had removed her gloves, tucking them neatly under her belt, her eyes calm as she watched the team work. Every plate toppled was now a piece of evidence, every casing scattered across the gravel a signature of her defiance. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The plates spoke for her. In the tower, Admiral Rogers sat alone in his office, blinds drawn to block the late sun. On his desk lay the initial report, crisp pages still warm from the printer. He read it twice, slowly, each number a thorn against his pride. But beneath the thorn was something sharper still: realization. The Navy had seen something undeniable today, and so had he. He tapped the report with one calloused finger, then leaned back in his chair. Sarah wasn't just another engineer with wild ideas. She was a force, the kind that reshaped doctrine, the kind that demanded to be reckoned with. For a long moment he sat in silence, his expression unreadable. Then, almost reluctantly, he reached for his pen and signed the report. His signature was not just approval, it was acknowledgement. The weapon and the woman behind it were now part of the official record. Back on the range, Sarah glanced at the horizon, where the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of amber and steel. The crowd had dispersed, but whispers lingered in the air. Officers who had laughed at her that morning now spoke her name with quiet reverence. Captain approached, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He stopped beside her, his voice steady, respectful. "You know what you've done today, Lieutenant. You didn't just prove a weapon, you proved yourself." Sarah turned, meeting his eyes. For the first time that day, a small smile touched her lips. "I didn't come to prove myself, Captain. I came to prove the system." Chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Maybe so, but the system doesn't pull the trigger." She didn't reply, but his words stayed with her. As dusk settled, the last of the technicians packed up their cases. The plates, dented and defeated, were loaded onto a truck, destined for storage as evidence. But everyone knew they would be remembered as more than scrap steel. They were markers of change. Sarah walked slowly back toward the armory, her boots leaving prints in the dust. The weapon she had built would be dismantled, studied, dissected by teams who would try to replicate what she had achieved. But the moment, the fire, the thunder, the silence that followed, could never be replicated. That belonged to her alone. In the distance, a bell rang out from the dockyards, signaling the end of the day. For Sarah, it signaled something more: the end of doubt, the beginning of recognition. In the files of the Navy, her demonstration would be reduced to cold data: 6 targets neutralized, 24.3 seconds. But to those who had stood on the deck and watched, it was more than numbers. It was a story, one that would pass from mouth to mouth, mess hall to war room. And somewhere in the Admiral's office, a signed report now carried her name, a name that would not be forgotten. Sarah had arrived mocked and underestimated. She left recorded, respected, and remembered. The mission files were closed, but her story had just begun.